How
U.S.
intelligence toppled foreign governments. In the fading glow of the post-war world, when silence settled over battlefields still scarred by fire, the United States confronted a future shaped by fear and uncertainty rather than triumph. Across continents, empires crumbled, borders shifted, and alliances dissolved like smoke, leaving behind a fragile order that trembled under every change in the political wind. The Soviet Union rose with determined ambition, stretching its influence across regions still weakened by war, stirring a quiet panic within the halls of Washington. It was in these tense hours that the United States forged a new kind of power, one not built on armies or flags, but on secrets, deception, and invisible motions beneath the surface of global affairs. The intelligence officers who survived the battles of Europe and Asia carried a different vision of conflict, believing that future wars would be fought not on open fields, but behind closed doors and silent cables. From that belief emerged the early CIA, a young institution cloaked in patriotism, yet driven by a mission far darker than its public image suggested, a mission that sought influence without accountability. Internal memos from those first years revealed a growing conviction that stability could not be trusted to diplomacy alone, and that hidden action might become the only safeguard against a world tipping toward chaos. Advisors argued that if a government anywhere threatened American interests, whether through ideology or alliances, then allowing it to stand was an unacceptable risk. Thus, the seed of intervention took root, nourished by fear, strategy, and the unspoken belief that shaping other nations was not merely possible, but necessary. To prepare for this new role, covert operatives were trained in methods that blurred the line between policy and manipulation, operating in the gray spaces where nations denied what they knew to be true. These officers learned that influence was a weapon sharper than steel, capable of toppling leaders, steering revolutions, and altering the course of nations without ever revealing the hand that struck. Yet behind their quiet confidence lay a haunting uncertainty, for even at its birth, the CIA understood that power wielded in darkness carried a cost that could not be measured in simple victory. Reports whispered that small decisions made in back rooms could ripple outward, changing lives oceans away, shaping destinies unseen by those who ordered the actions. Some officers questioned whether the United States had the right to determine which governments lived and which fell, but their doubts faded beneath the urgency of Cold War survival. And so the machinery of covert influence began to turn, slow at first, then with gathering momentum, guided by men who believed they were protecting the world even as they remade it. By the end of those formative years, the agency had already learned a powerful lesson, that once a nation embraces the shadows, stepping back into the light becomes far more difficult than expected. For in the hidden corridors of intelligence, every victory demanded silence, every mistake demanded burial, and every intervention carved a new scar upon the history of another land. And as the United States tightened its grip on global affairs, few understood that the age of quiet overthrow had already begun, waiting only for its first target to fall. The first tremors of America's hidden reach began in the late 1940s, as quiet committees gathered behind sealed doors to decide the fate of nations far beyond their shores, weaving plans that stretched like thin wires across maps. They feared that one misstep could tip the world toward chaos, so they crafted operations cloaked in silence, shaped by analysts who studied whispers as if they were weapons sharper than steel blades, trusting only in secrets and precision. In those tense years, the Cold War grew like a storm without thunder, and leaders believed that every foreign government leaning toward rival powers threatened the delicate balance that kept global conflict from exploding into open devastation. Thus began the rise of covert influence, first modest and cautious, then stronger as policymakers convinced themselves that preventing collapse required bold moves carried out in the shadows, invisible to the public eye, yet decisive in direction. Agents traveled under false identities, stepping into distant capitals where fear and opportunity intertwined, and their missions unfolded in dim cafes, silent halls of ministries, and crowded marketplaces where trust dissolved with every rumor. Every operation depended on fragile alliances with local figures who understood their homeland's pulse better than any outsider, though their loyalties shifted like sand in desert winds, creating uncertain ground beneath American strategies. Money, promises, and subtle pressure became tools as potent as weaponry, shaping political tides through persuasion or quiet threats that never appeared in records yet left profound marks on governments struggling to survive internal fractures. Some leaders welcomed the silent hand of support, believing it offered protection from rivals closing in around them, while others sensed the invisible chains tightening and fought to resist, unaware their battles were already calculated from afar. By the early 1950s, the scale of involvement grew wider, and Washington no longer questioned whether such interventions were justified, only whether they were effective enough to guard national interests in a world shifting by the hour. In confidential briefings, officials spoke of safeguarding freedom, yet beneath their words lay a sharper truth. Control was the ultimate objective, for control was the only shield against unpredictable alliances that might threaten stability. Foreign governments rose or trembled based on assessments drafted in quiet rooms lit by dim lamps, where analysts traced patterns of influence and concluded that a single well-placed action could transform entire regions without firing a shot. Moral boundaries blurred as decisions became driven less by ideals and more by strategic necessity, and the architects of these plans reassured themselves that history would someday understand the weight of choices made in hidden quarters. Yet even then, subtle doubts emerged among a few who wondered whether a nation could preserve its values while manipulating distant sovereignties, or whether each intervention planted new seeds of resentment destined to surface later. Still, momentum pulled them forward, tightening the machinery of influence until covert action became not an exception but routine. And every foreign crisis seemed to demand a response crafted in secrecy rather than through open diplomacy. By the end of that turbulent decade, the path was set, etched deeply into policy, and those who shaped it believed they were preventing catastrophe, even as forces they barely understood began to shift beneath them like restless tectonic plates. For the world was changing faster than their strategies, and unseen repercussions gathered quietly in the margins of history, waiting for the moment they would rise and reveal truths the architects never intended to face in the decades ahead. In the dawning years of the 1950s, the machinery of covert strategy grew into a vast network guided by analysts, field operatives, and hidden advisors who believed they were defending a fragile world from collapse through precision. These architects worked in dimly lit rooms where maps covered entire walls, and colored pins marked shifting loyalties, creating a portrait of global tensions shaped by whispered intelligence and rapid judgments that allowed no margin for hesitation. Each operation began with a single question: which government might lean away from American interests, and how swiftly could loyalty be restored without revealing the guiding hand behind the scenes that controlled the outcome of every decision. Reports flowed endlessly across polished wooden tables, describing leaders torn between rival pressures, their governments trembling under economic strain, unrest, and shadowy factions that foreign powers cultivated to gain influence quietly. From these documents emerged strategies sharpened by secrecy, crafted by minds trained to see opportunity in chaos. And they argued that intervention delivered stability faster than any treaty, making covert action the preferred instrument. Agents were dispatched to distant cities where rumors traveled faster than truth, and their mission was not merely to observe but to shape events, guiding subtle shifts in power that could change the fate of entire nations before dawn arrived. They met with ministers behind closed doors, offering advice disguised as concern, and if persuasion failed, they turned to alternative methods: economic pressure, strategic leaks, or alliances with groups eager for a chance to rewrite authority. Some operations succeeded so smoothly that local citizens never suspected foreign hands at work, believing their political transformation stemmed from internal will, while only a few insiders sensed invisible currents steering their country's future. Yet other missions unraveled when distrust spread like smoke through corridors of power, and agents found themselves navigating dangerous landscapes shaped by unexpected rivals who sought control with equal secrecy and determination. Through each success and failure, the belief that America must guide outcomes only strengthened, and policymakers argued that in a world divided by ideology, hesitation could open doors to adversaries determined to expand their influence. Still, beneath the bold strategies lay a quieter unease shared by a handful of officials who understood that every intervention altered destinies in ways impossible to measure, planning consequences that might surface decades later. They wondered whether shaping foreign governments through covert manipulation could truly preserve stability, or whether each action carried hidden costs that would eventually return, reshaping alliances and rewriting the moral narrative. Nonetheless, the momentum was relentless, driven by fears that rivals could exploit any hesitation, and the architects continued to design operations that moved silently across borders, unseen by the very citizens they affected most. By the middle of the decade, these interventions formed a pattern clear only to those inside the system, a pattern of rising and falling leaders shaped through whispers, influence, and decisions drafted far from the people they transformed. And as the world drifted deeper into confrontation, the architects convinced themselves that their actions were necessary, even righteous, unaware that their own legacy would someday be judged not by secrecy, but by the echoes it created. In the late years of the 1950s, a strange rhythm pulsed beneath global politics, as uprisings, coups, and sudden shifts in leadership surfaced far too quickly to be explained by ordinary tensions or natural movements of society. Whispers inside diplomatic circles suggested that unseen hands guided the chaos, shaping democratic landscapes not through open debate, but through meticulously engineered operations that unfolded in the shadows of distant capitals. Some nations awoke to the abrupt collapse of leaders who only days earlier spoke of reform and stability, and citizens wondered how momentum could vanish so swiftly, as if a hidden force had plucked authority from their grasp overnight. These transformations often began with subtle fractures, economic pressure, strikes, and internal rivalries amplified by covert influence, creating a sense of drifting uncertainty that made each government vulnerable to sudden political storms. Operatives embedded within newspapers, ministries, and cultural institutions helped steer public sentiment, releasing stories crafted to erode trust, or lifting alternative voices that promised a different and more obedient future. In many cases, the shift of power unfolded without a single shot, replaced instead by carefully choreographed demonstrations, resignations, or defections that flowed together like a silent tide engineered to wash away an unwanted administration. Foreign leaders, sensing invisible threats tightening around them, scrambled to strengthen alliances. But every message, every agreement, and every promise risked interception by intelligence networks working to reshape the landscape. Some resisted fiercely, rallying supporters and invoking national pride to counter foreign influence. Yet even the strongest appeals often crumbled when their own advisors shifted loyalties under pressure or secret persuasion. Each toppled government left behind a trail of questions. Why had the unrest intensified so rapidly? Who had funded the opposition? And why did events unfold with such uncanny precision that no one could identify the true masterminds? Historians later noted that these interventions followed a pattern: destabilize, divide, and redirect power toward leaders aligned with American interests, yet never reveal the extent of foreign involvement or the strategies used to achieve it. Among intelligence officials, success bred confidence, reinforcing the belief that covert action was not only effective but essential, a tool that preserved global balance against rivals eager to claim influence in critical regions. But beneath the surface of each operation lay moral contradictions. For those who orchestrated these shifts understood that stability purchased through manipulation might harden into resentment that could last for generations. Even within American institutions, quiet debates unfolded late at night as skeptical analysts questioned whether reshaping foreign governments through pressure and covert funding truly aligned with the ideals the nation celebrated. And yet, as crises erupted around the world, urgency overshadowed caution, and each debate ended with the same conclusion: that intervention, hidden or not, was preferable to allowing rival powers to tighten their grip on fragile states. Thus, the machinery kept moving, powered by fear, ambition, and conviction, while millions of people lived through political upheavals they never understood, unaware that distant decisions had silently rewritten the path of their homeland. By the early years of the 1960s, the world stood on the edge of a transformation shaped not by open conflict, but by countless covert operations whose fingerprints were scattered across continents like faint shadows at dusk. Nations that once held firm to their ideals now carried hidden scars, for each intervention left behind subtle fractures, political, cultural, and emotional, that continued shaping the future long after foreign operatives departed in silence. In the halls of intelligence headquarters, officials drafted new strategies, believing they had mastered the delicate art of influence. Yet few acknowledged the growing burden of consequences woven into every operation they authorized. Some analysts warned that reshaping governments in secret would one day return in unpredictable ways, for no nation manipulated from afar remained unchanged, and no citizen forgot the feeling of their destiny shifting without explanation. Meanwhile, public narratives across the world attempted to make sense of turmoil, offering stories of revolution, corruption, or patriotic resurgence, unaware that hidden forces had calibrated each outcome like precise gears in a vast mechanism. Foreign leaders who survived the storm spoke cautiously of invisible currents that pulled at their administrations, whispering of pressures that arrived without warning, leaving even the most powerful feeling watched by unseen observers. Though many documents remain classified, fragments of truth leaked through memoirs, quiet testimonies, and dusty archives, revealing hints of strategies designed to topple, rebuild, and redirect entire governments with silent intent. These fragments suggested that the struggle for influence had never ended, but merely changed its technique, evolving from open colonial rule to covert designs that shape nations subtly while avoiding the spotlight of global scrutiny. Yet even as the apparatus expanded, a quiet unease settled among those within it, for they sensed that a machine built on secrecy could not run forever without eventually confronting the moral weight of the futures it manipulated. Some feared that rivals had learned from American operations, crafting their own webs of influence that mirrored earlier strategies, creating a world where every government risked becoming a battleground of silent and competing agendas. Thus, the question emerged, whether power exercised in darkness could truly preserve stability, or whether each hidden intervention only deepened the world's uncertainty, planting seeds of distrust that might bloom decades later. Historians would later trace the rise and fall of numerous leaders, connecting events once thought spontaneous to invisible decisions made in quiet rooms thousands of miles away, decisions crafted by minds convinced of their necessity. But the deeper truth remained elusive, obscured by missing files, censored notes, and testimonies altered by fear or loyalty, leaving researchers chasing shadows that dissolved each time they tried to reveal the full extent of the influence. Even today, records surface occasionally, hinting that the story is far from over, that new strategies continue evolving, and that governments still tremble under pressures no citizen can see, pressures inherited from earlier clandestine eras. And so the legacy of those covert interventions lingers, unmeasured, unresolved, a reminder that the line between protection and domination grows thinner when power hides itself behind silence, shadows, and the illusion of spontaneous change. In the end, the greatest mystery is not how governments were toppled, but how these hidden actions reshape the world quietly, leaving us to wonder which events of our own time bear the faint, invisible imprint of the past.